Hi everyone, we're going to look at civil rights today. When you look at civil rights, they are different from civil liberties. When we talk about civil liberties, we're talking about the protections we find for individuals against the government. With civil rights, we're talking about the protection of groups and equality rights of those historically disadvantaged groups throughout our nation's history. When we talk about the issue of slavery, I've mentioned in the past, we talked about the Three-Fifths Compromise, and also you had something called the Missouri Compromise, which banned the admission of slave states from the Northwest Territory. Anybody that was admitted to the United States above this line of latitude around the state of Missouri, anything north of it would be a free state, and anything south of it would be a slave state. Also, you had in 1857 the case of Dred Scott versus Sanford, which the Supreme Court invalidated the Missouri Compromise and ruled that Congress could not ban slavery in the territories. So from the period of about 1820 to 1860, you had this contentious debate about how slavery would be divided up, if it should exist, or where it should exist in the United States. During and after the Civil War, we had three amendments that we affectionately called the Civil War Amendments. We had the 13th Amendment, which banned slavery, the 14th Amendment, which gave everybody due process under the law and protection before the law, and the 15th Amendment, which extended the vote to former male slaves. Now, after the Civil War and after the period of Reconstruction in the United States, we had something called segregation. We had Jim Crow laws that forced segregation of whites and African Americans and even prohibited black men and women from marrying white men and women. And then you had something called Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, which said that separate but equal was legitimate in our country and therefore sponsored segregation and supported segregation. We also had poll taxes, literacy tests, and property qualifications to deny African Americans the right to vote. In 1954, you had Brown versus the Board of Education that overturned Plessy, which meant that you could not have de jure segregation, which is segregation by law. But it did not address de facto segregation, where people can segregate themselves as long as it's not under the law. And we can't forget about the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s, which involved men and women like the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks. From the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s, you had two very important civil rights acts, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And even with all of these civil rights movements and pieces of legislation that have been passed, there is still work to be done in this country. With Native Americans, for example, it wasn't until 1924 where Native Americans had the right to vote. And many in the reservations of this country still suffer from ill health, poverty, and poor educational opportunities in our school systems. Hispanic Americans had labor movements in the 1960s and 1970s and have used African American groups as an example in how they can use the same tactics in getting rights in this country. Asian Americans are the fastest growing minority group in the United States, but we cannot forget about the court case of Korematsu versus the United States, where the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that internment in detention camps was constitutional. Disabled Americans have been able to benefit from the 1990 Americans with Disability Act, which guarantees disabled Americans access to public facilities, workplaces, and communication services. American seniors have benefited from the 1967 Age Discrimination and in Employment Act, or ADEA. The 14th Amendment of Due Process was put into place or used as an argument to favor same-sex marriage in all 50 states. That came from the court case of Obergefell versus Hodges. The women's movement in the United States began with revivalism, religious revivalism, abolitionist movements, and also the temperance movement in this country. That moved into the voting rights movement of the late 1800s and early 1900s. The women's movement evolved into the workplace and fighting for women's rights in the workplace and against discrimination in places of work based on sex. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 also created the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission to enforce that law. Current issues regarding women's rights in this country include the workplace, educational equity, sexual harassment, and women's roles in the military. And we also discuss sexual harassment and the Me Too movement in regards to women's rights in this country.